It was Christmas Eve, the kind of cold that burrowed into your bones and made you question why anyone would ever leave the warmth of home. Snow fell steadily, muffling the world in an eerie silence. Ella Turner pulled her coat tighter around her as she trudged up the hill toward her grandmother's house. The old Victorian stood alone on the outskirts of town, its silhouette dark against the moonlit sky, the windows like hollow eyes watching her approach. Ella hadn't wanted to come. Her grandmother's house was creepy even in daylight, but family tradition dictated that Christmas Eve dinner was a mandatory affair. Her parents had promised to meet her there later, delayed by the snowstorm that had rolled in. For now, it was just Ella and the house. The gate creaked as she pushed it open, the sound loud enough to make her wince. The path leading to the porch was slick with ice, and Ella nearly lost her footing. She reached the door and knocked, her gloved fist echoing through the emptiness beyond. No answer. She tried again, harder this time. Still nothing. "Grandma?" she called, opening the door cautiously. A blast of warm, stale air hit her face. The house was dark except for the faint glow of the Christmas tree in the living room. Ella stepped inside, shaking the snow from her boots, and closed the door behind her. "Grandma?" she called again, her voice shaky now. Silence. The only sound was the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Ella flicked on the light switch, but nothing happened. A power outage, she thought. Typical for a storm like this. She pulled out her phone and turned on the flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. The living room was just as she remembered. The faded floral couch, the porcelain figurines lined up on the mantel, the heavy drapes that blocked out the world. The Christmas tree stood in the corner, its lights flickering weakly. Beneath it were a few neatly wrapped presents, their shiny paper catching the dim glow. Something wasn't right. Ella couldn't put her finger on it, but the house felt wrong. The air was heavy, suffocating. She moved through the rooms calling for her grandmother, but there was no sign of her. The kitchen was empty, the stove cold. Upstairs, the bedrooms were undisturbed. Then she noticed the smell, faint at first, but growing stronger as she descended back to the main floor. It was sickly sweet, like rotting fruit mixed with something metallic. Ella gagged, pulling her scarf over her nose. The smell led her to the basement door. It was slightly ajar, and a dim light flickered from below. Ella's stomach churned. She told herself to turn around, to wait for her parents to arrive, but something compelled her to push the door open and descend the creaking wooden steps. The smell grew stronger with each step. She reached the bottom and swept her flashlight across the room. The basement was cluttered with old furniture and boxes, the walls lined with shelves of dusty jars. In the center of the room was a figure slumped in a wooden chair. "Grandma?" Ella whispered, her voice trembling. The figure didn't move. Ella approached slowly, her flashlight trembling in her hand. As she got closer, she realized it wasn't her grandmother. It was a mannequin, dressed in one of her grandmother's old robes, a wig perched lopsidedly on its head. Its face was crudely painted with a grotesque smile, and its hands were bound to the chair with red ribbon. Ella stumbled back, her heart pounding. She turned to run, but stopped dead in her tracks. Someone was standing at the top of the stairs. The figure was silhouetted against the faint light from the living room, tall and unmoving. In one hand, it held a large knife case, the blade catching the glow of the Christmas tree. "Who's there?" Ella demanded, her voice breaking. The figure didn't respond. It began to descend the stairs slowly, deliberately. Ella backed away, her foot catching on a loose floorboard. She fell hard, the flashlight skittering across the floor. The light spun wildly, illuminating the walls. That's when she saw them. Photographs. Dozens of them, pinned to the walls, each one of her. Some were recent. Her walking to work, shopping at the grocery store, sitting in her apartment. Others were older, from her childhood, Christmas mornings with her family, playing in the park. Ella's breath came in short, ragged gasps as the figure reached the bottom of the stairs. It stepped into the light, revealing a face obscured by a porcelain mask, the painted features eerily similar to those of the mannequin. "Why?" Ella managed to choke out, crawling backward until her back hit the wall. The figure tilted its head as if amused by her question. It raised the knife, the blade glinting menacingly. Ella scrambled to her feet, her hand finding a heavy metal candlestick on a nearby shelf. She swung it wildly, connecting with the figure's arm. The knife clattered to the floor, and Ella seized the opportunity to run. She bolted up the stairs, her boots slipping on the wooden steps. She reached the living room and grabbed her phone from the table, frantically dialing 911. The operator answered, but before Ella could speak, the line went dead. The phone's screen went black. No, 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 Ella whispered, tears streaming down her face. A floorboard creaked behind her. She spun around just in time to see the figure lunging toward her. Ella screamed, raising her hands in defense. But then there was a loud crash, the front door bursting open. Two figures stumbled inside, their faces illuminated by the beam of a flashlight. Her parents. The masked figure froze, turning to face them. Ella's father charged forward, tackling the intruder to the ground. The mask fell off, revealing a face Ella didn't recognize, twisted with rage and desperation. The police arrived soon after, alerted by a neighbor who had heard Ella's screams. The intruder was taken into custody, but questions remained. How had they known so much about Ella? How long had they been watching her? And where was her grandmother? The answer came days later when the snow melted enough to reveal the body buried in the backyard, wrapped in Christmas lights.
Story number 2.
It was late on Christmas Eve when Michael Stevens finally left the office. Snow blanketed the streets, and the city, usually bustling even at night, was eerily quiet. The walk to his car was lonely. The distant hum of Christmas music from a nearby store the only sound accompanying him. As he approached his car in the empty parking garage, Michael noticed something strange. A red envelope was tucked under his windshield wiper, bright against the dull gray concrete. He frowned, pulling it free. The envelope bore no name, just a golden stamp in the shape of a Christmas tree. Inside was a single piece of paper, neatly folded. He opened it to find 3 words written in crimson ink. Don't go home. Michael felt a chill crawl up his spine. He looked around the garage, but it was deserted. His first instinct was to laugh it off, probably a prank by one of his coworkers. But as he slipped into his car, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He started the engine and pulled out of the garage, the warning from the note lingering in his mind. He dismissed it as a joke and turned onto the main road. The snow fell heavier now, blanketing the windshield faster than the wipers could clear it. The drive home was unnervingly quiet, the kind of silence that makes you feel like the world has stopped. Michael tried to focus on the road, but the feeling of unease only grew. When he reached his neighborhood, the streets were dark, unusually so. Every house should have been lit up with Christmas lights, but tonight they were blacked out, as if the entire street had gone dark just for him. As he pulled into his driveway, his stomach churned. His house was the only one with its lights still on, but they flickered unnaturally, casting distorted shadows onto the snow-covered lawn. Michael hesitated. He thought about the note again. Don't go home. His phone buzzed, making him jump. It was a text from an unknown number. You're too late. The text hit him like a punch to the gut. He looked up at the house and noticed something he hadn't before, a dark figure standing in the living room window. Who the hell is that? He muttered, gripping his phone tightly. He turned on the flashlight and stepped out of the car, his breath visible in the freezing air. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he approached the front door, his heart pounding louder with every step. The door was unlocked. He stepped inside cautiously, the warmth of the house feeling oppressive rather than comforting. The living room was empty, but the air was heavy, as if someone had just been there. The Christmas tree stood in the corner, its lights flickering erratically. Beneath it, presents were scattered haphazardly, the wrapping paper torn, though he hadn't opened anything yet. Michael called out, "Hello? Is anyone here?" No response. He heard a faint rustling upstairs. Every instinct told him to leave, but he couldn't ignore it. Grabbing the fireplace poker as a makeshift weapon, he made his way up the creaking staircase. The hallway was pitch black, the only light coming from his phone. The sound grew louder, closer. He stopped outside his bedroom door, the noise now a frantic scratching, like nails on wood. Slowly, he pushed the door open. The room was empty, but the window was wide open, the curtains billowing in the icy wind. Snow had blown inside, covering the floor in a fine layer of white. And then he saw them, footprints, wet and heavy, leading from the window to the closet. Michael's grip on the poker tightened. He approached the closet, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The door was slightly ajar, and as he reached for the handle, the scratching stopped. He yanked the door open. Nothing. Just his clothes hanging neatly, swaying slightly as if disturbed. Relief washed over him, but it was short-lived. Behind him, the bedroom door slammed shut with a deafening bang. He spun around, his flashlight beam darting across the room. The figure was there, standing in the corner, It was tall and gaunt, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes were hollow, black pits, and its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. It wore a tattered Santa hat, but its body was draped in a filthy, blood-stained cloak. Before Michael could react, the creature lunged at him, its long, clawed hands reaching out. He swung the poker wildly, but it passed through the figure as if it were made of smoke. Michael screamed, stumbling backward. The creature didn't attack again. It simply pointed at the window and whispered in a raspy voice, "You should have stayed away." And then it was gone. Michael stood frozen, the room now deathly silent. His phone buzzed again, the screen lighting up with another text from the unknown number. "Leave now." This time, he didn't hesitate. He ran down the stairs and out of the house, not stopping until he was back in his car. As he sped away, he glanced in the rearview mirror. The house was dark again, but in the window, he saw it, standing there, watching him leave. Michael never returned to that house. When the police investigated the next day, they found no signs of forced entry, no footprints in the snow. But they did find one thing in the living room, the red envelope placed neatly under the Christmas tree with 3 new words scrawled inside. "See you soon."
Story number 3.
The wind howled through the towering pines as Clara pulled her scarf tighter around her neck. She'd taken the job of house-sitting over Christmas Eve for extra cash, figuring it would be easy money. The house, a sprawling cabin nestled deep in the woods, belonged to a wealthy couple who were out of town for the holidays. It was picturesque, the kind of place you'd see on a Christmas card. The fireplace crackled warmly, and the scent of pine needles filled the air from the freshly decorated tree in the corner. Outside, snow blanketed the ground in a pristine sheet. But as the evening wore on, Clara started to feel uneasy. The house was too quiet. Every creak of the wooden beams and whistle of the wind sounded amplified, like whispers in the dark. She tried to shake the feeling, convincing herself it was just the isolation playing tricks on her mind. At around 9 p.m., her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. Unknown number. "Did you lock the back door?" Her stomach dropped. She immediately texted back, "Who is this?" but got no response. Clara's heart pounded as she grabbed the fireplace poker and crept toward the back door. It was locked. She double-checked it, twisting the deadbolt with trembling hands. As she turned away, her phone buzzed again. Unknown number. "I'm already inside." Panic gripped her. She quickly scanned the room, but everything was as she left it. The doors were locked, the windows secured. She told herself it had to be a prank. The sound of shattering glass jolted her. It came from the upstairs bedroom. Clara froze. Her first instinct was to run, but the car was parked a good 50 yards from the cabin, and the idea of sprinting through the dark woods in the snow terrified her even more. She tightened her grip on the poker and slowly ascended the staircase, each creak underfoot making her wince. The bedroom door was ajar, swinging slightly in the draft. She pushed it open, bracing for the worst. The window was smashed, shards of glass glittering on the floor. Snowflakes blew in, dusting the wooden floorboards. But the room was empty. Her phone buzzed again. "Unknown number. You're making this fun." She backed out of the room, her breathing shallow. She had to get out. Whatever was happening, it wasn't safe to stay. Just as she turned toward the stairs, she heard it. A soft, wet sound, like something being dragged across the floor. It was coming from the guest room down the hall. Clara's instincts screamed at her to leave, but morbid curiosity drew her closer. She inched toward the guest room, her hand shaking as she reached for the doorknob. She pushed the door open and screamed. In the center of the room was a mannequin, the kind used for displaying clothes. Its face had been crudely painted on, a grotesque smile smeared in red. Around its neck was a Christmas garland, tied tightly as if it had been strangled. Beneath it, scrawled on the floor in what looked like blood, were the words, "You should have run." The sound of footsteps echoed behind her. Clara whipped around, but no one was there. The hallway was empty. Her phone buzzed once more. Unknown number. Too late now. She bolted down the stairs, nearly tripping in her haste. The living room was dark now, the fire extinguished, and the Christmas lights flickered ominously. As she reached the front door, she saw it, the shadow of a figure standing outside, just beyond the frosted glass. Her hands fumbled with the lock, desperate to get out, but when she threw the door open, the figure was gone. Only the snow-covered ground greeted her, pristine and untouched. Behind her, the floorboards creaked. She spun around, and there it was. A tall figure, cloaked in black, its face obscured by the shadow of a hood. It stepped toward her, and as it raised one hand, Clara saw what it held. Her phone. The last thing she heard was the soft chime of a new text message. Unknown number, Merry Christmas. Her screams were swallowed by the howling wind. When the couple returned to their cabin the next morning, they found the house undisturbed, save for a single red ornament hanging from the tree. Etched into its surface were 3 chilling words, "She's still here."
Story number 4.
Snow fell steadily on the small, forgotten town of Willow Creek. It was the kind of place where time seemed to stop, where everyone knew each other, or thought they did. On Christmas Eve, a single dimly lit diner at the edge of town remained open, catering to the few travelers brave enough to face the icy roads. Hannah, the waitress, was wiping down the counter when the bell above the door jingled. She looked up, startled. It was nearly midnight, and the diner had been empty for hours. A man stepped in, his face obscured by the hood of a long, dark coat. He moved slowly, deliberately, his boots crunching against the salt scattered on the tiled floor. Hannah forced a smile, her unease growing. "Late night?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. The man didn't respond. He took a seat at the farthest booth facing the door and placed his hands flat on the table. They were pale, almost gray, with long, spindly fingers. "What can I get you?" she called, her nerves tingling as the silence stretched. He finally spoke, his voice low and raspy. "Coffee. Black." Hannah nodded, quickly pouring a cup and setting it on the counter. She hesitated before walking it over to him. As she placed it down, she couldn't help but notice his eyes, sunken and dark, like twin voids staring straight through her. "Anything else?" she asked, stepping back instinctively. He shook his head, taking a slow sip. The bell above the door jingled again, and Hannah jumped. 2 more men entered, both dressed in heavy jackets, their faces tense. They glanced at the man in the booth before approaching the counter. "Evening," one of them said, his voice tight. "We're looking for someone. Have you seen a man come in here recently? Tall, thin, wearing a dark coat?" Hannah glanced over her shoulder at the booth. The man was gone. The cup of coffee sat untouched, steam curling lazily into the air. Her heart sank. "He was just here," she whispered. The men exchanged a glance. "If he comes back, you need to leave immediately," one of them said, his tone grave. "Lock the doors and don't let him in." "Why? Who is he?" Hannah asked, her voice shaking. The other man leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "Let's just say he's not normal." They left without another word, their boots crunching in the snow as they disappeared into the night. Hannah locked the door behind them, her mind racing. She turned back to the empty diner, trying to shake off the strange encounter. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. She nearly screamed when she saw the man in the dark coat sitting at the counter. "How did you?" she started, but her words faltered. He was staring at her, unblinking. A thin smile spread across his face, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. "I told you," he said, his voice unnaturally calm. "Just coffee." Hannah backed away, her heart hammering in her chest. She reached for her phone, but when she looked down, it was gone, vanished from the counter where she'd left it. The man stood, his movements impossibly smooth, like he wasn't constrained by flesh and bone. "You should have locked the doors sooner," he said, his voice now layered with an unnatural echo. The lights flickered, and the diner plunged into darkness. When they came back on, Hannah was alone. The man was gone, the coffee cup shattered on the floor. She stumbled toward the door, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the lock. But as she looked outside, her breath caught in her throat. The snow was no longer falling. The road, the trees, the entire world beyond the diner's windows, frozen in place like a photograph. The bell above the door jingled one last time. Hannah turned, and her scream echoed into the endless frozen night. By morning, the diner was empty, the door swinging open in the icy wind. On the counter sat a single black coffee cup filled to the brim. In its reflection, if one looked closely, they could see her face, trapped, screaming silently. No one ever stopped at the Willow Creek Diner again.
Story number 5.
The snowstorm had come out of nowhere, swallowing the back roads in a thick white blanket. Eric cursed under his breath as he squinted through the windshield, trying to make out the faint lines of the road. His wife, Lisa, sat beside him, clutching her phone, though it offered no signal this far from civilization. "I told you we shouldn't have taken the shortcut," Lisa muttered. Eric didn't respond. He knew she was right, but didn't want to admit it. The storm only seemed to grow worse, the howling wind battering their SUV. Then out of the darkness, a faint glow appeared ahead. As they drew closer, it resolved into a small, rustic cabin, its windows warmly lit despite the raging storm. "Looks like someone's home," Eric said, relieved. "We can't just barge in," Lisa protested. "Lisa, we can't stay out here. We'll freeze to death." Reluctantly, she nodded, and they pulled into the snow-covered driveway. As they approached the front door, Eric knocked loudly. After a few moments, the door creaked open, revealing an elderly woman with kind but tired eyes. She was dressed in a thick woolen sweater, her silver hair pulled back into a loose bun. "Please come in," she said without hesitation, stepping aside. The interior of the cabin was cozy, almost too perfect. A roaring fire crackled in the hearth, and the scent of freshly baked cookies lingered in the air. A Christmas tree stood in the corner, adorned with antique ornaments. "Thank you so much," Eric said as they stepped inside, brushing snow from their coats. The woman smiled. "No trouble at all. It's not safe out there in this weather." She introduced herself as Margaret and offered them hot tea and cookies. Despite her hospitality, there was something about her that made Lisa uneasy. As the evening wore on, Margaret spoke little, instead watching them with an intensity that made Lisa's skin crawl. When Lisa asked about a phone, Margaret only shook her head. "I'm afraid the lines are down," she said softly. Eric, exhausted, soon dozed off on the couch. Lisa, however, couldn't relax. The cabin was too quiet, the kind of silence that pressed against her ears. She wandered toward a bookshelf, running her fingers over the spines of old, dusty books. One caught her eye, a leather-bound journal with no title. She opened it and froze. The pages were filled with names, dates, and chillingly detailed descriptions of deaths. Beside each name was a crude drawing of a face, some with terrified expressions, others eerily calm. She flipped through frantically, her breath quickening until she found the last page. Her blood ran cold. There were 2 new names, Eric and Lisa. The date was today. "Looking for something, dear?" Margaret's voice startled her. Lisa slammed the book shut and turned, but Margaret stood unnaturally close, her face no longer kind. Her eyes seemed darker, deeper, and her smile stretched too wide. "We should go," Lisa stammered, backing away. Now," Margaret said, her voice soothing but icy. "The storm is still so fierce. Why don't you stay a while longer?" Eric stirred, groggily sitting up. "What's going on?" "Eric, we need to leave," Lisa shouted, grabbing his arm. But the cabin felt different now. The warmth was gone, replaced by an icy chill. The Christmas tree lights flickered erratically, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. Margaret stood motionless, her smile unwavering. "You're not going anywhere," she whispered. Suddenly, the door slammed shut and the windows frosted over, obscuring the outside world. Eric lunged for the door, but it wouldn't budge. Lisa screamed as the ornaments on the tree began to shatter one by one, releasing faint, echoing cries. The fire in the hearth roared unnaturally high, its flames turning a sickly green. Shadows swirled around Margaret, twisting and coiling like living things. "This house loves company," Margaret said, her voice now layered with inhuman tones. "It's been so lonely for so long." Eric and Lisa clawed at the door, but the cabin itself seemed to fight them. The walls groaned, and the floor shifted beneath their feet. As the shadows closed in, Lisa's screams joined the haunting cries that echoed from the shattered ornaments. By morning, the storm had passed, and the cabin stood silent once more. The fire crackled gently, the tree sparkled, and 2 new ornaments hung on its branches. Glass baubles with tiny, terrified faces etched inside. The road remained empty, but the cabin waited patiently for its next visitors.
Story number 6.
The clock on the wall ticked steadily, counting down the hours until Christmas morning. Mallory sat alone in her family's old farmhouse, the storm outside rattling the windows. Her parents were out of town visiting relatives, and she had declined to go, eager to enjoy a quiet Christmas Eve with a mug of cocoa and a book. The house was nestled deep in the woods, miles from the nearest neighbor. Normally, the isolation was comforting, but tonight it felt oppressive. The storm had knocked out the power hours ago, leaving only the flicker of candles to cast long, wavering shadows across the room. As she sat curled under a blanket, Mallory heard it. A faint sound, almost drowned out by the wind. A knock. Soft, hesitant, and completely out of place. She froze, her heart thudding in her chest. The nearest road was buried under snow, and no one should be out here in this weather. The knock came again, louder this time. Gathering her courage, Mallory grabbed a flashlight and moved cautiously toward the front door. "Hello?" she called, her voice wavering. No answer. She peered through the peephole, but the porch was empty. Her stomach twisted. Maybe it was just the wind, she told herself, though the thought did little to soothe her nerves. She bolted the door and returned to the living room, trying to shake off the unease. Minutes later, another sound echoed through the house. This time, it wasn't a knock, but a slow, deliberate scraping, like nails dragging across wood. It came from the back door. Mallory's blood turned to ice. She crept toward the kitchen, the beam of her flashlight trembling. The scraping stopped just as she reached the door. Holding her breath, she pressed her ear to the wood. Silence. Suddenly a loud bang erupted from the front of the house. She spun around, nearly dropping the flashlight. It sounded like something or someone had thrown themselves against the door. She ran back to the living room, her pulse pounding. The door was still bolted, but the handle jiggled violently as if someone was trying to force their way in. "Go away," she shouted, her voice cracking. The handle stopped moving, and for a moment, everything was still. Then she heard it, a soft, chilling laugh, high-pitched and childlike. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing through the house. Mallory's knees buckled. "Who's there?" she whispered. The laughter stopped, replaced by the sound of footsteps. They were heavy, deliberate, and they were coming from upstairs. But that was impossible. She had been alone all night. Her flashlight flickered as she backed away, clutching it like a lifeline. The footsteps grew louder, closer. "Mallory," a voice whispered, low and guttural, drawing out each syllable. She screamed, running for the door. She fumbled with the locks, her hands shaking so badly it felt like an eternity before she managed to throw it open. The freezing wind hit her like a wall, but she didn't stop. She sprinted into the storm, the snow stinging her face. She didn't look back until she reached the edge of the woods. When she finally dared to turn, the farmhouse stood dark and silent against the white expanse. And yet, in the upstairs window, she saw it. A figure, impossibly tall, with hollow eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. It raised a hand, waving slowly, mockingly. Mallory didn't wait to see more. She stumbled through the woods, her breath coming in ragged gasps, until she found the main road. A passing plow driver spotted her and took her to safety, though she could barely explain what had happened. When the storm cleared the next day, police went to the farmhouse. They found no signs of forced entry, but in the snow outside the front door were footprints, small, barefoot prints that stopped abruptly as if whoever made them had simply vanished. Mallory never returned to the farmhouse. And every Christmas Eve she hears it, the soft knock, no matter where she is.
Story number 7.
The Christmas market was bustling, even as the first flakes of snow began to fall. Tasha loved the festive atmosphere. The warm glow of string lights, the aroma of spiced cider, and the laughter of families enjoying the holiday spirit. She had come alone this year, hoping to distract herself after a difficult breakup. She wandered through the stalls, admiring handcrafted ornaments and sampling sugary treats, when she noticed a peculiar booth tucked away in the shadows, slightly removed from the cheerful crowds. Unlike the others, this booth had no lights, no festive decorations, just a simple wooden table with a sign painted in faded looping script. "Wishes granted." Curious, Tasha approached. An elderly man sat behind the table, his face hidden beneath the brim of a wide hat. "What kind of wishes?" she asked, half laughing. The man tilted his head, and for a moment she thought she saw something strange in his shadow, something impossibly tall with too many limbs. But when she blinked, it was gone. "Any kind," he said, his voice soft and gravelly. "But beware, wishes come with a cost." Tasha hesitated. The breakup had left her raw, and the idea of undoing her pain, of being happy again, was intoxicating. "How does it work?" she asked, her voice quieter now. The man slid a small slip of parchment across the table. "Write your wish. Nothing more, nothing less. Then fold it and place it in the box." A plain wooden box sat at the edge of the table. It looked old, the kind of old that carried secrets. Tasha took the parchment and stared at it. She hesitated, the pen hovering above the surface. Finally, she wrote, "I want to be truly happy." She folded the paper carefully and dropped it into the box. The man nodded once, his face still obscured by the brim of his hat. "Your wish is granted," he said. That was it. No flash of light, no dramatic flourish. Feeling foolish, Tasha left the booth and rejoined the crowds. That night, as she walked home, a strange sense of peace washed over her. The heartbreak that had clung to her for weeks seemed to lift, replaced by a warmth she couldn't explain. By the time she reached her apartment, she was smiling. But the next morning, things began to change. She woke to a strange noise, a faint tapping, like fingernails against glass. Groggy, she sat up and looked toward the window. Nothing. Shrugging it off, she went about her day, and for the first time in weeks, she felt light, as if a weight had been lifted. Her friends noticed too, commenting on how radiant she seemed. But the tapping returned that night, louder this time. It echoed through her apartment, growing more insistent. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. There was no answer, but the air felt heavy, charged with something she couldn't name. The tapping continued, and then came a whisper, a voice that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. "You wished for happiness," it hissed. Tasha's blood ran cold. She backed away from the window, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "I don't want it anymore," she stammered. The whisper turned into laughter, low and menacing. "But you have it now. You'll be happy, no matter the cost." Over the next few days, her life became a waking nightmare. She found herself smiling uncontrollably, even when her heart raced with terror. The tapping followed her everywhere, at work, in her car, even in her dreams. And then the shadows came. At first, they were fleeting, a flicker in her peripheral vision. But they grew bolder, darker. She would catch glimpses of figures standing at the edge of her vision, too tall and distorted to be human. When she tried to tell her friends, they didn't understand. They saw her perfect smile, her glowing demeanor, and assumed she was thriving. "You look so happy," they said, oblivious to the shadows that loomed just behind her. One night, the tapping grew deafening, reverberating through her apartment like a drumbeat. She screamed, begging for it to stop, but the shadows closed in. You wished for this," the voice whispered again, cold and merciless. The next morning, Tasha's apartment was silent. Her friends found her sitting at the table, just beside her, face frozen in a serene smile. But her eyes were wide with terror, staring into a corner of the room where the shadows seemed to linger just a moment too long. The booth at the Christmas market disappeared after that night. No one remembered seeing it, and the elderly man was never found. But every now and then, a faded sign appears in the corners of forgotten markets, promising to grant any wish for a price.
Story number 8.
The snowstorm howled like a living thing, battering the old church that stood alone at the edge of the forest. Its stained glass windows shimmered in the dim light of the flickering lanterns inside, casting eerie colors on the cracked wooden pews. James was the last to leave the midnight Christmas service, lingering after the others had braved the storm to return home. He had volunteered to lock up, but now he regretted it. The storm had worsened, and he wasn't keen on the half-mile walk to his cabin through the swirling snow. He pulled his coat tighter and moved to extinguish the lanterns. As he reached for the first one, he heard it, a faint knock, muffled by the wind but distinct. It came from the church's side door, the one leading to the graveyard. James froze, his hand hovering over the lantern. Who could possibly be out there in weather like this? He waited, heart pounding, but the knock came again, louder this time. "Hello?" he called, his voice echoing in the empty church. The knock stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to swallow even the sound of the storm. Gathering his courage, James grabbed a lantern and walked toward the side door. The old wood creaked as he unlatched it and pushed it open. The graveyard lay blanketed in snow, the headstones barely visible beneath the drifts. No one was there. James stepped outside, the cold biting at his face, and looked around. The snow was untouched, no footprints leading to the door. A shiver that had nothing to do with the cold ran down his spine. He quickly shut the door and bolted it, deciding he'd had enough. The lanterns could burn all night for all he cared. He needed to leave. As he turned to retrieve his coat, the organ began to play. The deep, haunting notes filled the church, reverberating off the stone walls. James spun around, his breath catching in his throat. The organ sat in the choir loft at the far end of the sanctuary, its keys moving on their own, the massive pipes roaring with sound. "Is someone there?" he shouted, his voice cracking. The organ stopped abruptly, the final note hanging in the air like a warning. James grabbed his coat and ran for the main doors, but as he reached them, they slammed shut with a deafening boom. He tugged at the handles, but they wouldn't budge. It was as if the storm outside had frozen them shut. "Let me out," he yelled, pounding on the heavy wood. A soft laugh echoed through the sanctuary, cold and mocking. James turned slowly, his back pressed against the door. The lanterns flickered wildly, their light dimming until the church was bathed in shadows. At first, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him, but as the shadows deepened, they began to take shape. Tall, gaunt figures with hollow eyes and mouths that stretched too wide. They moved toward him silently, their feet not touching the ground. James stumbled backward, tripping over a pew and falling hard to the floor. The figures surrounded him, their hollow eyes fixed on his trembling form. "Leave me alone," he screamed, his voice echoing in the vast emptiness. One of the figures stepped closer, its skeletal hand reaching out. Its touch was ice cold, searing through his coat and into his skin. "You shouldn't have stayed," it whispered, its voice a chorus of hisses. "This place isn't for the living." James scrambled to his feet and ran, his mind a blur of terror. He made for the choir loft, hoping the height would give him an escape route. The figures followed, gliding effortlessly, their movements impossibly fast. When he reached the loft, the organ began to play again, the notes discordant and maddening. He looked down at the sanctuary below, his heart sinking as he saw more shadows pouring in from the graveyard door, their twisted forms filling the church. Trapped, James did the only thing he could. He climbed onto the organ bench and began smashing the keys, hoping to drown out the noise. The sound grew louder and louder, the notes clashing in a cacophony that made his ears ring. The shadows froze, their heads tilting as if confused. Seizing the moment, James grabbed the lantern from the organ stand and hurled it toward the figures. The glass shattered, flames spreading across the wooden floor. The fire roared to life, its light banishing the shadows. They shrieked, their forms dissolving into black smoke as the flames consumed them. James wasted no time, climbing down and breaking a window to escape. He stumbled into the snow, gasping for air. Behind him, the church burned, the flames illuminating the night sky. When the villagers arrived the next morning, they found James huddled near the tree line, mumbling incoherently about shadows and music. The church was reduced to ashes, but the graveyard remained untouched. The villagers rebuilt the church years later, but no one dared to stay there alone after dark. They said the organ still played sometimes, faintly, even when no one was there. And on snowy Christmas Eves, some claimed they could see shadows moving among the gravestones, waiting for another unwitting soul to linger too long.
Story number 9.
The small cabin was warm, a stark contrast to the icy grip of the blizzard outside. Anna and her younger brother, Jacob, had retreated to their family's remote holiday getaway for a quiet Christmas Eve. The snowstorm had come unexpectedly, isolating them completely. The power had gone out hours ago, and the only light came from the flickering flames in the fireplace and the soft glow of a battery-powered lantern. The cabin's creaks and groans were amplified by the howling wind, and Anna found herself glancing toward the windows more often than she wanted to admit. "It's cozy, isn't it?" Jacob said, trying to sound cheerful as he worked on a puzzle at the kitchen table. "Sure," Anna replied, though her unease was growing. The storm had a sinister energy, like something more than just snow and ice was pressing against the cabin. As the evening wore on, a sudden thud against the front door made them both jump, probably just snow falling off the roof. Anna said quickly, more to convince herself than Jacob. But then it came again. Thud, thud. This time it was unmistakable. Someone, or something, was knocking. Jacob froze, his wide eyes darting to Anna. "No one's supposed to be out here, right?" "No," Anna said, her voice tight. They stared at the door as the knocking continued, louder and more insistent. Anna grabbed the fire poker, holding it like a weapon as she moved toward the door. "Who's there?" she called, her voice shaking. The knocking stopped abruptly, replaced by silence so heavy it felt oppressive. Anna's hand hesitated on the lock. "Don't open it," Jacob whispered, his voice trembling. But Anna couldn't ignore the gnawing curiosity, or the faint sound of crying now coming from the other side. A child's sobs, weak and pitiful. "Help!" the voice whimpered. "Please, help me!" Anna's heart clenched. It sounded like a young boy, no older than Jacob. She turned to her brother, who shook his head vehemently, fear etched into his face. "What if it's a kid lost in the storm?" she said. Jacob didn't reply, but his expression spoke volumes. "It doesn't feel right." Anna hesitated for a moment longer before unlatching the door and pulling it open. The storm howled into the cabin, and for a moment she saw nothing but swirling snow. Then a small figure appeared, shivering, pale, and barely dressed for the weather. It was a boy, no older than 6, his face tear-streaked and his lips blue. "Come in," Anna said, pulling him inside and shutting the door quickly. The boy didn't speak, only stared at her with wide, vacant eyes. Anna wrapped a blanket around him and guided him to the fire. "What's your name?" she asked gently. He didn't answer. Jacob, still at the table, watched the boy with suspicion. "Where did you come from?" The boy turned to Jacob, his head tilting slightly. "I was lost," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. Anna frowned. Something about his tone sent a chill down her spine. She noticed that, despite being close to the fire, the boy's skin remained unnaturally pale. "Where are your parents?" she asked. The boy's lips curved into a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Outside." Anna's unease deepened. "Outside? In this storm?" The boy nodded slowly. "They're waiting for me." The room seemed to grow colder, the fire dimming slightly. Jacob stood and moved closer to Anna, gripping her arm. "I don't like this," he whispered. Before Anna could respond, the boy turned to look at the door. "They're coming now." As if on cue, the knocking resumed, louder and more frantic than before. The boy's smile widened, his teeth unnaturally sharp. "Don't open it," Jacob begged, pulling Anna back. But Anna couldn't move, her eyes locked on the boy's face. His features seemed to shift, his eyes darkening until they were hollow pits, his smile stretching impossibly wide. The knocking turned into pounding, the door shaking on its hinges. "They're here," the boy said, his voice now a deep, guttural growl. Anna snapped out of her trance, grabbing Jacob and backing away from the door. The pounding grew louder, the wood splintering as something on the other side pushed harder. The boy stood, his small frame seeming to grow taller, his shadow stretching unnaturally across the room. "You shouldn't have let me in," he said, his voice echoing with malice. The door burst open and the wind screamed through the cabin. Shapes moved in the snow, tall, gaunt figures with glowing eyes and elongated limbs. They stepped inside, their presence suffocating, their faces twisted in cruel grins. Anna and Jacob screamed, retreating toward the corner of the room as the shadows closed in. The last thing Anna saw before the light faded completely was the boy's face, grinning at her with inhuman delight. The cabin was found weeks later, buried under a blanket of snow. The door hung open, the interior coated in frost. Of Anna and Jacob there was no sign, only a single child's footprint leading out into the endless white.
Story number 10.
The small town of Hollow Pines was known for its quiet, picturesque streets, lined with snow-dusted trees and warm, glowing windows during the holidays. But for as long as anyone could remember, there was one house on the edge of town that no one visited. It stood dark and empty every Christmas, its roof sagging under the weight of neglect and the ever-present snowfall. No one knew who had owned it last or why it had been abandoned, but stories swirled about strange sounds and lights that came from the house on Christmas Eve. Some claimed to hear faint singing, others whispers that grew louder the closer you got to the front door. Few dared to investigate, and those who did never spoke about what they'd seen. This Christmas Eve, 3 teenagers, Nick, Emily, and Jack, decided to see for themselves. Fueled by boredom and bravado, they trudged through the snow under the faint light of the moon, flashlights in hand. "This is so stupid," Emily muttered, hugging her arms against the cold. "What if it's not just rumors?" "Then we'll finally have proof," Jack said, his tone dismissive. "Everyone's scared of this place, but it's just an old house." Nick stayed quiet, his eyes fixed on the looming silhouette of the house ahead. He'd been the one to suggest the adventure, though now he wasn't so sure. Something about the house felt wrong, even from a distance. When they reached the front gate, it creaked open on its own. Emily stopped in her tracks, glancing at Nick. "Wind," Jack said, though there wasn't even the faintest breeze. They stepped inside the overgrown yard, their boots crunching through the snow. The house loomed larger up close, its windows black like empty eye sockets. The door, surprisingly, stood ajar, inviting them in. Jack was the first to enter, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The interior was just as decayed as the outside, peeling wallpaper, sagging floors, and furniture draped in thick layers of dust. Yet the air was heavy with the scent of pine, as though someone had just brought in a Christmas tree. "This place is gross," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. "Can we just look around and leave?" "Scared already?" Jack teased, but his own voice wavered. Nick stayed close to Emily as they moved through the house. The deeper they went, The colder it became, their breath visible in the faint beams of their flashlights. The eerie silence was broken only by the sound of their footsteps. Then they heard it, faint music drifting from upstairs. It was an old melancholy tune, played on what sounded like a music box. Okay, that's creepy, Jack admitted, but he was already heading for the staircase. Jack, don't, Emily hissed. We should leave. Just a quick look, Jack said, ascending the stairs. Nick and Emily reluctantly followed, their flashlights flickering as they climbed. The music grew louder, leading them to a room at the end of the hallway. The door was slightly open, and golden light spilled out into the dark corridor. See? Jack said with a grin, pushing the door open. Nothing to be scared of. His words caught in his throat. The room was immaculate, a sharp contrast to the rest of the house. A grand Christmas tree stood in the corner, its ornaments glinting in the warm light of the fire, crackling in the stone hearth. Presents were piled beneath the tree, their wrapping paper pristine and colorful. But it was the figures seated around the dining table that made them freeze. 4 people sat there, a man, a woman, and 2 children, their faces pale and waxy, their eyes staring unblinkingly at the untouched plates of food in front of them. They were dressed in old-fashioned holiday clothes, and their smiles were frozen in an unnatural rictus. What the? Jack whispered, stepping back. The air grew colder, and the music stopped abruptly. The figures turned their heads in unison, their movements slow and mechanical. Their empty eyes locked onto the intruders. Leave, the woman said, her voice hollow and echoing, as if it came from deep within the walls. Jack stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the threshold. We need to go. Now. Nick grabbed Emily's arm, pulling her away as the figures began to rise from their chairs, their movements jerky and inhuman. The fire in the hearth dimmed, casting the room in eerie shadows. The 3 of them bolted down the hallway, the air filled with a chilling laughter that didn't belong to any of them. The house seemed to twist and shift around them, the stairs stretching impossibly long as they tried to flee. They burst out into the night, the door slamming shut behind them. The house loomed in silence once more, its dark windows staring out at the snowy landscape. Panting and trembling, they stumbled back to the main road, not daring to look back. None of them spoke as they made their way home, their minds racing with what they had seen. The next morning, the house was gone. The lot where it had stood was nothing but untouched snow, as though it had never been there at all. But on Christmas Eve, the locals swear you can still hear faint music drifting through the air and see flickering lights where the house once stood. A reminder to those who dare to seek the answers that some doors are best left unopened.